Tom Jones, welcome to Thinking Class.
Thanks very much for having me, John.
You're very welcome. For the listeners who don't have the benefit of seeing Tom on YouTube, they might be wondering why Tom Jones doesn't have a deep Welsh accent. This is because it is not the Tom Jones you may have been expecting, so we won't be talking about his discography today. But this Tom Jones is an equally good Tom Jones, may I say. And I've followed this Tom Jones on Twitter since I joined upon the launch of Thinking Class. I think the algorithm threw us together because we share the fact that we're both Northern Englishmen, but I'm glad it did. He has some very humorous, sometimes black pill, but also hopeful and optimistic takes on the state of politics in the United Kingdom. So, Tom, I'm really glad you've joined me today, and you're interesting for many reasons, but one of them is that you're a local councillor, which means that you do some public service and some local politics, which isn't that common for people, particularly those who are in their early 30s. So, I'd like to start with what drove you to be a councillor.
Well, I'd like to start by saying thank you very much. That was a fantastic, lovely introduction that I don't really feel I deserve. But then I've got curly hair, and I don't think I deserve that either. I think
the other Tom Jones also has curly hair, so you're in good company.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And whilst I'm, I'm not that Tom Jones, but for 20 pounds, I'll be whoever you want me to be. I think the first thing that drove me to be a councillor was a really slightly embarrassingly old-fashioned sense of, I don't want to call it noblesse oblige, because that makes it sound like I'm some kind of, aristocrat, 13th Duke of Wimborne or something like that. That I have always believed that if you are in a position in which you can give back to society, that you should do. And I think that was something that my mother instilled in me, who was a child protection social worker and has, she's a raging socialist. But she has a very, very, very strong social conscience. And I think she kind of instilled that in me, that I've actually had, although this sounds very woke, I've had a very privileged upbringing, and I've been very lucky, and I've been put in a position where I have the ability to give back to the community that's given me so much, and therefore that's what I have to do.
That is a take that I know to be very uncommon amongst people of our generation. If you hear about anyone who wants to make a difference, as it were, it generally is phrased or framed with terms like, I want to make an impact. And usually that entails getting into big corporate jobs and working on goals that have been set up by supranational institutions or NGOs and anything that's couched in that language. And this concept of a sense of service that's tied to a place with the people that you rub shoulders with every day is certainly different from making any impact in that other way. And I suppose it is at the very heart of what it means to be conservative, and in this case, I'll say small c conservative rather than aligned with the Conservative Party. But you've referenced your mum's politics, called a raging socialist, which suggests your politics, and you're a conservative councillor, big C conservative councillor. I think anyone who is of our generation, whether they're millennials or the generations afterwards, there are lots of slights about conservatism and conservatives in general. What do you think that people commonly get wrong about conservatism?
I think actually To be fair, I don't think that people of my generation get much wrong about conservatism. If I'm being honest, I think they have interpreted conservatism as it has been presented to them. So we have had a government for the last 13 years that has basically been interested in conserving the wealth of the wealthy, has been relatively uninterested in, I don't want to say expanding the means of production, but has been relatively uninterested in giving people a stake in society. And I think actually, you know, the vast majority of people who are our age are uninterested in conservatism, quite rightly, because it's given them nothing, you know. And I had this conversation with Ben Sixsmith on the Critic podcast a while ago, and he made the point to me that the old saying that you become, if you're not socialist by the time you're 20, you've got no heart, and if you're not a conservative by the time you're 40, you've got no head. That doesn't work, because you suddenly get to 30 and you start reading like Reflections on the Revolution in France by Edmund Burke and thinking, wow, this guy's making some really, really good points. It's that as you age, you build up a stock of, I mean, you might also, to be fair, you might also think that, but what happens is that as you age, you build up a stock of both financial and cultural capital. You build up essentially a standing in society that makes the society you're a part of worth conserving. And I think one of my, essentially my whole Twitter brand is decrying what conservatives do in government. And part of the reason I can do that, I think, is because we are essentially presenting a block a lot of the time on a very, very natural progression for people to become conservative. And that's things like wealth accumulation makes you more conservative. Owning your own home makes you more conservative. The big conservative turn in most people's lives is owning kids, but having kids. We don't do that anymore. It's having kids. And actually, the average age of first-time home buyers, first-time mothers, first-time fathers is rising and rising and rising because of things like our refusal to build houses, our refusal to overcome entrenched NIMBYism within the party and within society. So basically, the Conservative Party, in a lot of ways, is signing its own death warrant all the time.
Yes, and I suppose even if you think about the root of conservatism being to conserve, and you look at what has been conserved or not been conserved in this case, whether it be the family silver, as it's often referred to, whether it's things that were once owned in the state sector that no longer are, whether it's even the concept of a British culture that's recognisable. There's not so much you can look back onto and say that's the thing that I'm trying to maintain and enhance and protect and bequeath. It's all just become a little bit vacuous, and as you say, there are material things that can't actually be grabbed a hold of anymore. And this point you make about people taking much longer to form families or own homes. I mean, there are some really crazy graphs which show just how precipitous a drop-off things have been on those fronts, and on the home owning front. I don't exactly know what the data is, but the last graph I saw floating around the internet from one of the various statistic producing organizations that are official. And, you know, let's be honest, they would usually, their dog in the fight would be to try and make that look as good as possible. So the fact that it was this low is scary, but something like in the last 40 years, it's gone from being, you know, 70% of 28 to 35-year-olds owning their own homes to something like less than 30%. It might have even dropped lower than that. Sorry, it might even be around about 10%. And yeah, I don't know where all this is going. But one interesting thing that I think to pick up on is, I don't know if you saw this, but last year, I think it was last year, or maybe back end of the year before, Financial Times published an article which got a bit of traction, which celebrated that people were becoming, they weren't following that becoming more conservative over time model, which you'd referenced earlier, and that, in fact, people were remaining more liberal. There's multiple ways we can interpret that. But I think what is interesting about that is that we are unable to we're unable to even point to anything that it is that we're aiming to conserve anymore, that we're not even able to present a positive case for it because of whatever has happened with regards to reputation trashing of conservative parties. Whereas actually, a lot of the things that I think might be causing a lot of issues for us is probably a lack of conservatism, a lack of restraint from making big decisions and thinking that we can figure things out with grand plans and throwing off these informal structures and restraints within society. So actually, when I see those things celebrated, that scares me a little bit, because then you think you're going more headlong into it. But I also just wonder if the question's being reframed incorrectly, because Gen Z, they're often brought up as being, oh, this is when things are going to change so much. They're clearly going to be even more liberal than the millennials. But I'm sure you would have seen this on your time on Twitter. There seems to be an awful lot of Gen Z people who are not going that way, where they're going, hang on, why are we paying so much for all of this stuff, whether it's housing? Why have we got such a bum deal? And why is it that we are inviting people into the country and giving all of them this support, but not us? We're your own. We're your young people, and that seems to cut across class and ethnicity of those people who are already here in Britain. So I wonder what your take on that is. Do you think Gen Z are as liberal as everyone says they are, or do you actually think there's a sense of growing reactionary backlash in there?
Oh, I think there's definitely a sense of reactionary backlash. Basically, I think one of the problems is that we look around at the country that we inhabit, and, you know, I know you were talking about black pills and being quite hopeful earlier in the introduction. Actually, you do have to question whether as a conservative, I want to conserve this Britain, and I'm not sure I do, because I think there are the vast majority of things need improving in this country, and I think we are reaching a slightly unique time. So previously I've been on the Politics Joe podcast, and I've quite friendly with the Politics Joe presenters, and it's very, very interesting that actually on a lot of these issues, you talk about homeowning, actually we agree with not only the problems but the solutions. You know, there are certain disagreements. You know, if you're looking at homeowning, I would say if you're going to increase homeowning, you've got to increase house building and reduce immigration. They would probably say just increase house building. But generally, on the kind of central issues, I think it is becoming less a left and right issue. I think it's becoming less a class issue. I think it's becoming more a generational issue. And again, I think that's something that Conservatives actually need to take the blame for, because since we have taken our place in government, we have entrenched a lot of the problems of intergenerational disparity. We have not encouraged a intergenerational trickle-down effect. You know, 1 in 4 pensioners is now a millionaire. And the rate of home ownership amongst, as you said, amongst young people is incredibly low, because there is just not that bumping down of generational wealth. And I think that's going to be a real problem actually in the future. But I think that's an economic problem to which there are quite obvious solutions to that, you know, which are, you can structure it around tax incentives. You can incentivize people to give money from boomers down through the generations. And that's actually an easy solution that, to be honest, young Conservatives like me have been crying out for years. You know, the ending of the triple lock pension, things like that. If we ended the triple lock pension, we could maybe not have the highest rate of tax since World War II, or the highest level of public spending since the 1970s, as we do at the minute. And those, I think, are quite easy wins for Conservatives. For young Conservatives like me.
Sorry to interrupt, Tom. Are the hard wins linked to something that you write about quite a lot, around the concept of the blob, or you know, another term could be statism, this idea that centralized government and affiliates will organize and social and economic affairs. Are the hard wins looking at where that taxation is going and deciding, I don't know, Javier Milei style in Argentina, what needs to be fuera, you know, getting rid of government department. Yeah, I mean, that is an unbelievable video. For anyone who hasn't seen it, it's worth a watch, just for the comedy of it.
Oh yeah.
But is it, what are the hard solutions to it? You mentioned some of the easy ones. Is that will that ever be touched? Will you ever have a Javier Milei moment here?
So I have written a lot of pieces. So what I was talking about earlier is basically the material conditions to enable conservatism, right? We have not created the material conditions in order to allow generations to gradually become more conservative, which is the fundamental failing of the last 13 years of Conservative government, as I see it. But you're right; those are the easy wins, because those are material conditions, and you essentially need to change the tax structures to change that. But you're right; we also have the highest level of public spending since the 1970s, and it is going on things that are fundamentally unconservative. I think a Conservative Way Forward report found that we spent something like £7 billion a year on political campaigns. So I've written about art galleries in Manchester that are hosting art that called Priti Patel a racist for calling people who earn less than £23,000 a year unskilled migrants, which is a perfectly legitimate political viewpoint, but maybe not on our dime and not on our time. You know, the great example recently is Kneecap. You know, there's this Irish band who are all like mid-30s, by the way. Go get proper jobs. They are all mid-30s, and they basically, as far as I can work out, their art is expressly anti-English, not so much political as in party political, but very, very anti-English. And they got a grab for 15 grand, and the Conservative government pulled it, and now the government is being sued to give them that money back. And I'm sat there thinking, it's good that the Conservative government has pulled the funding. Why was the funding there in the first place? That is a huge, huge problem. And I think this probably comes to the bigger issue here, which is the dominance of the blob, or what you call statism, in modern political governance, which is that frankly, the blob governs and that conservative ministers don't. And I think this is the thing that's really rotten in the state of Denmark, is that we have had 13 years to govern conservatively, and we have basically failed completely because our governing strategy is bankrupt and is fundamentally wrong. And this is a very long story about which I've written quite a lot. And it starts with Thatcher's civil service reforms, which put, kind of eliminated ministers from the day-to-day running of the government departments. And that is the kind of ministerial, that was the elimination of the relationship you see in Yes Minister or Yes Prime Minister, in which Jim Hacker can still outmaneuver Sir Humphrey by making changes to the kind of machinery of government. So after Thatcher, because she was finding she had so many wet ministers, she basically eliminated that system. And she made it much more kind of business-like, basically, which worked very, very well for what she wanted to do. And then that continued throughout Major's government, as it was, if you can call it a government. And then what Tony Blair did, and this is yet another of one of the terrible constitutional reforms that Tony Blair did that the Conservatives have failed to overturn, is he saw potential in what Peter Burnham, the academic Peter Burnham, called the politics of depoliticisation. So basically, because Labour had a very dubious, economic credibility, it had dubious governing credibility because of how long it had been out of government, and because New Labour was a new product. It was, to the people who wanted to vote for it, it was new, and to the older people who wanted to vote for it, they still saw it as, incompetent 70s Jim Callaghan type government. And basically, he outsourced a lot of the governance to quangos, NGOs, and outside bodies, which allowed the new Labour government to basically take the credit for decisions whilst outsourcing the actual decision-making process. So if you moved your some of your fiscal decisions to the OBR, for instance, the Office of Budget Responsibility, it lent you an economic credibility that New Labour didn't have. The unofficial governing structure of the OBR did have. And I think spending on NGOs went up something like 7 times under Blair. And when we took that, again, lasted until it lasted throughout Gordon Brown's government, if you can call it government, and went through to David Cameron, at which point he announced the Big Society, which was essentially an invitation for community groups, charities, and institutions to get involved more and more with the politics of decision making. And basically, that was where the blob really started to thrive. And I think fundamentally, until we come up with a governing, as Conservatives, I think until we come up with a governing solution to combat that blob, I think we will continue to take government as we have in the last 30 years and essentially not be in control.
Does it sound like it's there's a new extension of the blob on the way, but with a veneer of democratic accountability? I had just seen that Labour, should they form the next government, have decided to bringing citizens' assemblies on a range of issues, which is what they get criticised for is that ultimately it becomes a convening spot for the loudest points on a certain issue, and that those people who are convening them, they can lead with leading questions to determine the outcome they want, and then bring it back and say it's been ratified. What prospects do you see, that knowing that we've got citizens' assemblies likely on the way to join that myriad of other blobby-like apparatus? What prospect do you see of that changing in the future, and when? Presumably, at the end of a Labour government potentially, and why should we? I suppose to put an even finer point on it. Second question: why should people be worried about the blob and not dismiss it as some kind of conspiratorial idea?
I would say that there are quite a few questions in there, and I think that to deal with the concept of citizen assemblies first, I think a great example of how this will actually work is how the overground lines were named. They basically went out and spoken to the blob, and they held that the DNCO, the advertising agency they employed, basically went off and spoke to other members of the blob. It spoke to activists, academics, historians, and spoke to them about a very, very limited range of, this is something I wrote about for CapEx, a very, very limited range of London history that basically conformed to a pre-decided answer. And essentially what blob governance is a forum for the blob. And this is exactly what citizen assemblies will be, it will be a forum for the blob to astroturf decisions that are already taken, and the blob will speak into the blob. And we already have a citizens' assembly, which is Parliament. And I'm, other than bypassing Parliament, I'm not really sure what citizens' assemblies add to our democratic conversation. And I think it's quite clear that actually what it will be is, it will be full of people asking leading questions to get the answers that have been pre-decided under a Labour government. And I think the reason you should be worried about that is, for a start, because we should not have these decisions astroturfed. Because fundamentally, one of the great things about democracy is you know who makes the decisions and you make them accountable for those decisions. And if they aren't accountable for those decisions, I think Aaron Bastani had a piece about this the other day. If they aren't accountable for those decisions, who do you hold accountable? Because you can't remove unelected bureaucrats, but it's very, very easy for politicians to blame those bureaucrats, fire those bureaucrats, and move on with their lives. But actually, our method of democratic control is the vote. And it is therefore politicians that we should be forcing to take these decisions. So I think that's part of the reason that people should be worried about the blob. That's the reason people of all stripes should be worried about the blob, which is a lack of democratic accountability. But if you are a conservative, the reason that you should be worried about the blob is that these people fucking hate you. Um, there's no reason, there's no point in dressing it up. These people fucking hate you. These people hate everything about you. These people hate your values, and they want you gone. They want you completely eliminated from public life. And you can see that in the appointments of Toby Young, Roger Scruton, Catherine Birbalsingh to public bodies. They were hounded out because they're conservative, but for no other reason than that. So allowing the blob governance of the public sphere is essentially, I mean, it's surrender of the public sphere. At which point, you know, even if you win back government, you then have to win back the public sphere as well.
Taking a step back a little and also going deeper into the philosophical depths of the blob and how it even came to be a mode of governance. And maybe you might have a sympathetic ear to this. I know you write about post-liberalism, which to give listeners who maybe aren't as au fait with the arguments of why we now live in a post-liberal world, is there are some political philosophers, people like Patrick Deneen, who've made a case for it to say that liberalism has failed, but it's baked into the system, that liberalism throws off all settled ways of living and community and any form of self-government, whether at an individual level, so how it is that we stay on a virtuous track, develop character, keep our heads down and away from vices, become productive citizens, and then live well within our communities, and our communities are able to self-govern and make decisions for themselves and look after their own interests. And up until the rise of big regulatory movements, I suppose, within or ideological movements within from the 1930s onwards, you generally would have quite a lot of self-sustaining movements. And here in the United Kingdom, we had lots of parish councils and local councils that had quite a lot of clout before they were centralised. I sometimes wonder whether being governed by regulatory fiat, whether by a centralised government, a supranational institution, whether it's by quangos, NGOs, is ultimately our fate for now no longer being able to self-govern, because we don't have the means anymore. It's not passed down. That's one of the things that we didn't conserve, whether it be through, you know, the kind of Judeo-Christian, Greco-Roman philosophical values that used to underpin national life, European life. What do you make of that?
So I think the question of whether we live in a post-liberal society or not, I think is a really, really interesting one. And I kind of, when I first took political office, that was the first time I think that I had thought very, very hard about my politics and actually about what kind of politician that I wanted to be. And I think initially I was very, very, very post-liberal. And I think I was post-liberal in a slightly Burkean sense, in that actually what I wanted was I wanted a restoration of community by the elimination of the state. So I saw, because I represent a very, very rural area, I saw groups that had got themselves together, you know, to buy the local pub. For instance, I've got two community-owned pubs in my division. And those were completely self-forming, self-governing, self-sustaining groups that merely needed the state's help in order to form community. And I think that is a very kind of Burkean view. That is a very Burkean group, because it is essentially the little platoon that is doing work. And my problem, I think, with a lot of post-liberal thought that I have, you know, since I've been thinking more about politics, I think my problem with a lot of post-liberalism as it is that it is essentially entirely based on the idea of the state arbitrating responsibility. And the nation state is not the primary keeper of the common good. Post-liberals have a much stronger use of the state than, say, neoliberals. And that consists of, it is a means to assert national sovereignty. It is a way to protect citizens. It is, the last groaning bulwark against the unrelenting savagery of the world. But you cannot turn a nation state into a national community. And the analogy I use for this is a great kind of church roof. The church roof is sustained by a series of beams. And each one of those beams, the kind of torrent of ribs, has to bear its weight in order to hold that roof aloft. And those beams are the kind of local, durable, self-governing associations, institutions, groups that constitute the building blocks of our common life. And each one is, in its way, almost insignificant. But the gradual erosion over hundreds of years, leaves the roof of, the national sovereignty and national community, that leaves the roof preciously unsupported. And basically what I think has happened is that the roof is collapsing in, and we're trying to pop the roof back up instead of repairing the beams first that can support it. But I think one of the interesting things about post-liberalism is it feeds back into a conversation that we had earlier, which is about the intergenerational disparity. One of the big problems with post-liberalism is that it talks a lot about the rebalancing of rights and duties. And I'm never quite sure. It always seems to be one more duty away from handing out a right, but it never quite gets there. So, at the minute we're talking about, there's been papers from Onward, for instance, about bringing back national service, and, which you can agree. I mean, I think it's absolutely mad to bring back national service, because if you're not going to make it about the military, you're going to be putting them into community endeavors, which are basically going to be woke madrasas. So you're giving foot soldiers to people who fucking hate you. But, we have got a generation at the minute who have sacrificed sometimes 10% of their lives to lockdown, who are facing the biggest fall in living standards on record, highest tax burden since World War II, highest public spending since the 1970s, on average won't be able to afford a house until they're well into their late 20s, unless they live in London, in which case good fucking luck. And we are now talking about taking 2 more years out of their lives to do what? Like, how can you ask more of a generation that has already given so much and that are essentially being handed nothing? Because we're not interested in making sure the wealth trickles down to them. We're not interested in making sure that they have the right of home ownership. We're interested in theory, in like building more homes, but actually, we're not prepared to look at the tax structures because that's unpopular. We're not prepared to look at building more homes because that's also unpopular. I think one of my problems with post-liberalism is it loads an awful lot of responsibility on current generations, and it very, very, very short on rights. And one of the things about post-boomer government and post-boomer politics is we are going to have to accept a lower standard of state help and state support than the boomers enjoyed, because that was completely unsustainable, because they were just a massive voting bloc who could vote themselves whatever they wanted. And it has come at such a cost that, you know, current generations are now paying for that. And we are going to have to pivot towards essentially what Macron quite rightly called the end of abundance. But that can't surely involve, you know, indentured servitude for 2 years for people on the grounds of being young. Surely what actually we should be looking at is reducing the cost of living and creating a more productive economy to pay for some of the welfare state growth through growth, rather than just kind of dragging down the future generations.
Yeah, that's a compelling economic argument, and I think you could even add a cultural argument as to why national service won't necessarily engender what you would want it to engender, which I think behind it may be this idea of a kind of enhanced or an elevated or even just an existence of some kind of patriotism or national feeling, a sense of national community. But I know Roger Scruton wrote about it. I think it was about a year after the Brexit vote. It's 2017. And he wrote a book called Where We Are and the State of Modern Britain. And he did make a more general comment about the type of lives that we live in modernity. And one of them being that most people now spend their time, and in the case of Gen Z, and he didn't have this data in front of him at that point, apparently in case of Gen Z people, they spend a quarter of their waking lives at a minimum on social media. And what Scruton's point was no one actually does rub shoulders anymore or has an encounter with the people on the streets that they share a home with. They spend their time networked into countless faceless, touchless individuals anywhere and everywhere, and that sense of community is not really there anymore. And so maybe that does just leave us only with the economic argument: is can you then just become some kind of a benevolent state in terms of enabling economic progress to be able to get people to go, do you know what? Yeah, quite like this place. This is good, and I'm loyal to it, and I'm not disavowing it at every second. How likely that is to happen, I don't know, but yeah, who knows where we go culturally when I think it's plain to see that there are many young folks that don't have any time for the country, and I certainly used to be one of those. I mean, I used to growing up in my 20s. Generally just read The Guardian over and over, and found myself.
We all have no crosses there.
Yes, found myself generally just doing the country down, and I'm not entirely sure that national service would have made me feel any warmer toward it. In fact, I would have just seen it as proof that it's this tyrannical state. So yeah, there are many reasons why not to go for it. Tom, you've written about what the future might hold for Britain, and one such term that has become popular, or not so much popular, but it certainly hit the airwaves recently. You've written about it. I know Aris Roussenos, who writes for the Unherd, quite a lot has written about it. This concept called Anglo-futurism. What is it, and why do you support it?
Anglo-futurism is this great, fantastic idea that is, you know, completely unreachable. I mean, it's nothing more than a pipe dream. That Britain has a future that is just not managed to climb. And it's, you know, it's completely undoable, completely unrealistic, but it's important to have dreams, isn't it? So Anglo-futurism, I think, started in, and I do not claim to speak for them or understand it that much, but it started as a kind of aesthetic movement in Anon posters on the right wing, and then I kind of consumed it via their AI-generated images and the Aris Roussenos piece, which people haven't read, people should read. But basically, it's a vision of Britain if we were doing things, if we had a government that was capable of doing stuff, which it seems we have a government, and I'm actually genuinely not sure that change of government will change this. We have a government that is basically incapable of doing stuff. So a lot of the particularities around Anglo-futurism are the vast increase in infrastructure. So a lot of these kind of Anglo-futurists images are infrastructure that looks fantastic and is built really, really well. And in that sense, I think it's a callback to the Victorian era, where, you know, the Victorians built pumping stations in like a neoclassical style. Everything the Victorians built was needlessly complicated, and it was needlessly grand, and we were so much better for it. And I think, you know, there is a concept of the enshittification of Britain, where now we have train stations. You know, when the Victorians built train stations, they built Newcastle Central, which is absolutely glorious. They built St Pancras, they built King's Cross, which, you know, has this amazing industrial iron and glass ceiling. Newcastle Central has, you know, the same kind of ceiling. Almost every provincial town in Britain, almost every town or city in Britain has an amazing Victorian railway station, and all the suburbs have modern railway stations that are fucking horrible because they have been created in using modern building regulations that basically make it impossible to build nice things. And I think Anglo-futurism is slightly a response to the aesthetic enshittification of Britain and a desire for us to build buildings that look a lot nicer as well as are practical. And I think that's part of it. And I think what it also is a latent desire for a government to be able to actually build those things in the first place. So a lot of these images are of things like small modular nuclear reactors, or of things like, I think there's a thing of spaceports, you know, huge cargo container ports. There are also quite famous series of particularly right-wing ones of border defences that are just basically massive seawalls off Dover. And I think in a lot of ways, I think this is a latent desire for a government that is able to do things that the current Conservative government has not been able to do, which is, for instance, lower the cost of energy, lower the cost of living through increased energy production, through small modular nuclear reactors, and through to lower the cost of living and protect the countryside through mass adoption of rail systems, HS2, maglev systems, and apparently to defend our borders by putting up massive iron seawalls. So yeah, I think Anglo-futurism is basically, I think it's partly about futurism, but I think it's more about a reaction against what we are not achieving in the here and now.
Yeah, I suppose there's some common themes in it. A self-reliance to a degree. I think generally whether people could put their finger on it. I think people are quite sick of having to import absolutely everything, whether it's energy, whether it's goods. We want to get back to making some things again, getting some spades in the ground for things that'll last. And yeah, the vernacular architecture point that you make is an important one. Things that look beautiful and that feel familiar. And let's be honest, are the things that Britain is famous for, and why people visit it far and wide and come to choose to live here and take their selfies in front of, are all these buildings you talked about. And I don't know if you follow the account on Twitter, the Culture Critic account. Excellent. I mean, the guy who runs that, every day a thread dropping into your account, either schooling you on the great artists of the past or the great cathedrals. His most recent threads that I saw anyway was on vernacular architecture, and it started with this picture of a city, and it was a financial district of a city. He said, "Can anyone guess where it is?" And I knew it only because I'd been there, but it's totally unremarkable. And that was the point, in that every city has followed this model of skyscrapers, glass and steel buildings, generally spherical or jutty edges, or cylindrical or jutty edges, or a mixture of the two. And exactly. And it was a picture of Frankfurt city centre. And he was like, I don't understand why the Germans, in this case, have embraced such an architecture when what they're well known for, and I appreciate it can't be half timbered houses everywhere, but you know what you think of when you think of Germany. And you can think about that if you think about Japan, and even places in India, if you've seen them, places in France, is that there's a way of being, and it's in tune with the landscape, the people, and their mores. And I don't see there being any conflict in this idea that we can look towards some kind of future whilst also having some kind of a nostalgic look at the past. And I'll invoke Scruton again, because he talked about how nostalgia is often dismissed, and it's used as a pejorative that is only for backward-looking, regressive people. But he said some of the greatest works of civilization have been based on nostalgia. The Greek root is nostos, which means like a yearning for home or something. Said the whole of Odyssey and the Iliad were written about that. Homer, this great man, the whole story was about him going home. And it's okay to want that, and it's okay to want to maintain it some way. It's like it is a realization that thing's gone, but you can find ways in which to live on, and things that are built that are going to stand longer than, well, maybe not in the case of new buildings, but if we were to build in that style, the places you've mentioned, the ones that are still standing will stand for much longer. The ones that aren't is because we ripped them down in an act of cultural vandalism. People want those. So yeah, I think we could go back to it. And I know Ed West has written about it on one of his Substacks, this notion of why is it that we build houses in a certain style and flats in a certain style when people don't want to live there? And some people say that's not true. They do want to live there. And then you can pull out any number of surveys that hold side by side something built in a kind of classic Georgian or Edwardian or Victorian style next to something that is modern, and people will roundly choose the former, the vernacular style. And so, yeah, I think we should embrace that. I don't know if anyone will. I think you're right. I don't think we can expect that from a Labour government, and I don't think we can expect it from a government until such point as our GDP to debt ratio isn't basically on parity. I want to throw a few more things in the mix, and this is entering into the end zone, but I'm sure it won't be a quick one to unpack. So I want to start bringing up some other isms that you've written about, and one of them is immigrationism, or as the French have popularized this. And so I'll get my kind of Poirot accent on immigrationism. So what do the French mean when they talk about immigrationism or immigrationism?
Immigrationism, insofar as I understand it, it's a term that has been coined by the French. I think it was an anthropologist, Pierre-André, and I would also like to apologise for my French pronunciation, Tajueth. And it's basically that the idea of immigration is both inevitable and good. And from that stems an entire approach to immigration that governs basically most Western nations, because immigration is both inevitable and good. But the most important thing for people to do is break down barriers to immigration. And he writes very, very interestingly. It was, I've written about this on my Substack. I've written about it for the Critic, but if you really want to understand it, go and Google it. And it's in a copy of Le Figaro, I think, that is conveniently translatable into English. I'm not intelligent enough to read French, barely intelligent enough to read English. But basically, that is the idea that immigration is both good and inevitable has downstream effects that are very, very, very recognizable in almost any Western nation when we talk about immigration. So it becomes a process of intimidation because it is good and because it is inevitable. You have to break down barriers, and therefore you have to break down the people that are placing barriers in the way of further immigration. And that is when you get people accusing other people of racism when they talk about an opposition to immigration. I think that was particularly prevalent in Britain in the run up to 2016. I think after Brexit, we kind of broke the idea of talking about immigration being racist. I think that was kind of dismissed, and yet ironically, immigration has skyrocketed since then. But it's now from a more diverse set of places, so apparently that's okay. Which is absolutely not what people voted for, but that's by the by. So yeah, immigration is basically an enforcement mechanism for a group of people who believe that immigration is good and inevitable. And generally, they tend to be what Matt Goodwin might call new elites. So they are, intellectual elites. They will be financial elites. And I think a fundamental part of this is something I call neo-slavery, which is the idea that you will just constantly import a low-wage workforce forever in order to subsidize the living standards of a particularly middle-class elite, intellectual elite that actually cannot afford the lifestyle that they have. And I think one of the unintended consequences about Brexit going forward will be an increase in competition between immigrant groups, so that we used to have a lot of EEA immigration, which was actually a net beneficiary to the Chancellor. We now have a lot of non-EEA immigration, which is a net drain on the Chancellor. But actually that allows for wage competition in the open market, as it were. So if you were previously pre-Brexit paying for your breakfast, let's say it's something woke like 2 smashed avocados and scrambled eggs and smoked salmon. Right? If you have that pre-Brexit and that's made by, let's say, a Spanish, we have quite a lot of Spanish people in services because the youth unemployment rate in Spain was so high. If it was previously made by people in Spain and now the immigration parameters are equalized, it's now made by somebody from, say, Indonesia, and it's made even cheaper, which allows basically the government to avoid the real consequences of immigration, because it is essentially a form of hue and quantitative easing, that you are absorbing cost increases through the importation of a lower wage workforce from abroad. and we will just continually find the lowest wage workforce.
Human quantitative easing. Now, there's a slogan, there's a saying that I can see become a bit of a slogan at some point in the future. One, no doubt, there ends up being an immigration reckoning. It certainly seems to be headed that way at some point in the future. Going back to your point about accusations of racism, when people call into question the policy of mass immigration, I read recently a book by Christopher Caldwell that preceded another book which is probably more famous, The Strange Death of Europe by Douglas Murray. This book was Christopher Caldwell's The Reflections on the Revolution in Europe. And he was talking a lot about mass immigration within that book and what that meant culturally. And there was a quote in there which I think fits nicely to this idea of shaming people to questioning as to that policy. And the quote is this: "There are, however, great problems with shame as a means of governing. For one thing, opposition does not disappear, but only becomes unspeakable, making the public even less knowable to its rulers. For another, shame as a government weapon works only on people capable of feeling shame. It thus purges high-minded people from the opposition and ensures that when the now mysterious public does throw up an opposition, it will be led by shameless people and take a shameless form." I think what Caldwell's trying to get at here is you need to be able to have these conversations out in the open and not seek to shut them down, because if you don't, you're going to end up with a very ugly face shown in the end. And as far as I can see, that ugly face hasn't shown itself at the moment, which is good. I think those people who are questioning the policy, it seems to be on two separate grounds. There's the cost ground, which recently what's been quite interesting in European countries is, I think just before Christmas, the Dutch had run a study as to how much immigration cost and which groups and which immigrants cost them the most. And then just last month, the Austrians did it, and they were exorbitant figures, huge amounts of money. And then everyone was going, "Oh, Britain would never do that." But someone's gone and done it. I can't remember who it is, but something just came out in the last few days pre-recording this, which said that since 2020, immigration to Britain, or immigrants living in Britain that have arrived since that point, have cost the country £36 billion. 12 billion of that was spent on foreign students. So that's an awful lot of money. And considering we now couch things in economic terms when we discuss things in the political realm, I dare say that's going to become quite a talking point. And the other study which has been released that challenges that immigrationism policy is about culture. And usually that's off topic, but because now it's in the eyes of, this is being framed in the eyes of the immigrants themselves. So it's interviewing the immigrants. Why is it that you tend to choose somewhere like the United Kingdom? And the answers that have most commonly been given by people is because there are already large amounts of people like us there. It's really low effort to get there. Once we're there, we can feel comfortable. And so that throws into the light once more is, can you ever achieve a level of integration and social cohesion when that becomes one of the key motives? But interestingly, the findings of that study were people aren't necessarily coming just for the welfare state, even if it does seem to be true that Britain has created an international welfare state that's open to everyone.
Yeah, I think one of the things that this raises is that fundamentally you're right. I think when Tejieff wrote that piece, one of his points was that the ethics of conviction, especially if it is forced, is not policy. And I think that is increasingly becoming clear with our immigration policy. I think one of the interesting things at the minute is that we have a degree of outridership, and it's a degree of outridership with people who are saying that multiculturalism has failed. And, you know, I think Suella Braverman was actually one of the first people to say this. She made what she called a civic argument, which was that, you know, multiculturalism's problem is that it makes no demands of the newcomer to integrate. It has failed because it allows people to come to our society and live parallel lives in it. And that essentially allows people to be in the society, but not of the society. And I think, I think that's really, really interesting, because I think that was the first time for a long time that we have had a frontline politician who was prepared to tackle uncontrolled immigration, inadequate integration, and, you know, the misguided dogma of multiculturalism. I think that the fact that we have some conservative frontline politicians prepared to say that shows that there is a growing movement of people who are prepared to make these arguments, and I think that's more reflective of society, frankly. Because the fact is that you can't meaningfully integrate people when you are, you know, in the last 2 years we've allowed a city the size of Birmingham into Britain. You cannot come up with meaningful policy integration for that number of people. It's just not possible. It's just not possible. And what that means is that what we have essentially had to do as a society in order to enable a level of immigration that is this high is to water down what it means to be British and what it means to fit into British society. And one of the key tenets of multiculturalism is that essentially there is no monoculture, and that there is no first or foremost culture within Britain, including British culture. I think basically that when we allowed when we started becoming an immigrant, a country that allowed mass immigration, what we did was, David Goodhart describes this. What we did in order to allow that was we replaced the glue of ethnicity, which is a very, very kind of visible glue, you know, on the basis of race. We replaced that with the glue of values. And so that made it relatively easy to accept Commonwealth immigrants, because we would, you know, we got immigrants from India who were relatively culturally conservative. We got people from the West Indies, also very culturally conservative, familiar with like British forms of governance, familiar with British legal systems. And then as we expanded our remit of all the sources of immigration out, we gradually dissolved those, we dissolved that glue of values to the point where we can no longer really ask or make any demands of newcomers, and we can't even really ask them what their beliefs are. Which I think is a real problem for social cohesion going forward. And I think you do see that with, I do think you see that with a lot of the protests around Gaza, and I'm quite worried about that, what that holds for the future.
Yeah, I agree, and I think there are tough conversations to come, and I think they're ultimately starting. I mean, if you go and watch news channels and generally keep your finger on the pulse, you'll find people who are long retired out of the political game, the public service game, saying that they're really worrying about the rapid rise of sectarianism within our culture and its impact on political life. So definitely worries for me as well, and I'm sure for many people out there. let's try and finish on a more positive note. Douglas Murray said in a recent Spectator article that soon he'd be the only commoner he knows, owing to all of the titles and knighthoods that Buckingham Palace now dishes out. And within that, he suggests you don't have to be particularly great to be honoured in this day and age. And there was recently a bit of a kerfuffle on the internet about Tim Martin of Wetherspoons fame being awarded a knighthood. And there were lots of people who were criticising him for that and losing their minds over Tim Martin for getting that. But you wrote a piece about why he deserved one. Why does Tim Martin deserve a knighthood?
Oh boy, now you really hit me where I live. Everything else was kind of bump until now. So for people who don't know, which will be almost everyone, because I don't do it for likes, I do it to be interesting. I run an Instagram account called Spoons But Nice, which is basically I do an architectural history of all the Wetherspoons that I go and drink in. And I think Tim Martin absolutely deserves this knighthood, because what Tim Martin understands about the British pub that almost nobody else does is that its place is as a third place between work and home. And in order to be successful, basically you have to fit into the slightly Victorian tradition of being obscenely grand. And to that end, Tim Martin buys a lot of incredibly amazing provincial buildings. Keeps them open. A lot of them are grade 2 listed minimum. I was in the Winter Gardens in Harrogate with my girlfriend yesterday, and it is just an incredible building. You walk down, it's got a split staircase as you walk down. The entrance hall is neoclassical. You walk down, it's got originally it has some of the original iron and glass ceiling, and then you walk further in and it has this wonderful pattern ceiling. And I think what Tim Martin understands is that the pub is neither a place to drink, nor is it a place to eat. It is a place to socialise. And I think he has basically created, he has analysed and created the perfect English setting for people to socialise in. And I think you look at a lot of the other chain pubs in Britain, you look at the Hungry Horse, or, oh God, what are the other ones? It's not just Hungry Horse, is it? There are a couple of other like
the Harvesters,
Green King.
yeah.
Harvesters, yeah. Green King aren't too bad, actually. They've got some good pubs. But yeah, the Brewers Fair, that's the other one. So these are, my mother calls them plastic pubs. They are completely confected. They're all new build. They are horrible, because the thing that Britons love, that Tim Martin understands, is that Britons love history, and they love needless grandiosity in the pubs. I was talking about Newcastle Central earlier. The station pub in Newcastle Central has tiling on the walls that is 20 feet high, and apparently the tiles are worth about £10 million. And Victorian pubs had this weird thing of just being completely overdone in needless grandiosity. And I think Wetherspoons are they are the only pub company that has ever appreciated and replicated that. And I think that's why Tim Martin deserves his knighthood. I think Tim Martin will do more than anybody else in Britain to save the pub.
I think you're right. And I think there are three solid reasons there for him to have a knighthood. There's the protecting and maintaining Britain's architectural heritage. There is bringing people together, contributing to social cohesion. That's been a common theme of things that have been lacking today. So, all power to him there, and also being a big employer.
Any post-liberal who does not support Tim Martin is just, it's cosplay.
Yeah, cosplay. Tom, it's been an absolute pleasure, and hopefully for those who are not so conservative-minded can now see that there is a friendly face and some deep, heartfelt thought to it, and you're not. Everyone's not just evil if they say they're conservative. So it's been a pleasure. You've mentioned a few times on the podcast that you write in various places and you got various accounts. Where can people find you?
So they can find me on Twitter at 93 Vintage Jones. They can find me on Substack at the Potemkin Village Idiot, which is quite an appropriate name, I think. And on my Substack and on my Twitter, I post most of my writing, which is at the Critic, is at CapX, and is generally at Come Home and a few other places, but it's mainly there.
Tom, an absolute pleasure. Keep up the good fight.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me on, John. And thank you for listening.
Catch you next time. Thank you for joining me in Thinking Class today. To keep up to date with all that I am doing, please subscribe to the Thinking Class YouTube channel at Thinking Class and follow me on X at Thinking Classes. Thinking Class seeks to understand the civilizational issues we face and why what our leaders do in response matters. Here, I seek to explore the ideas, values, and culture that made our civilization, those that are unmaking it, and how leaders at our public and private institutions should respond. Engage with me on YouTube or X, or write to me at thinkingclasspod@gmail.com to tell me who you want me to speak to and what topics are important to you. I look forward to seeing you there and for joining me on this journey.